It's fascinating what has happened to the state of California. Of course, we both remember that it wasn't always as leftist as it is today. At what point and why do you suppose it shifted so dramatically, such that places like LA and San Francisco are just they're falling apart? I mean, it's like black hole just descending into chaos.
It's a great question, Eric. The Reagan Library is just over the hill here from where we are in Malibu, and we do events there at the library on a regular basis. The history between when Reagan was president and certainly on to Pete Wilson during the 90s and even Schwarzenegger in the early 2000s to where we are today, I think is in large part founded upon the major forces here in California politics, which are frankly the public sector unions. They are such a major player here. When I grew up in Jersey, I thought about California as just this kind of freewheeling place, a place of the West with cowboys and so on. And I never thought about it as being a real kind of union-dominated state. But when you get out here and sense the politics, certainly in teachers' unions and otherwise, those are the places that have a real stranglehold on our politics.
I'm always fascinated by how people fail to keep up with what's happening. In other words, I have in-laws that I think of as FDR Democrats. Like they forget that the party has dramatically changed and that history has changed. And I think a lot of people are that way. In other words, they don't realize that there was a time when we needed unions. In the 1920s, 1930s, people needed to step up for the working man. The working man did not have anyone to look out for his interests in the way that was appropriate. And so unions came into being, but there are people who got stuck there and they still think of the unions as, well, we're fighting for the little guy, we're fighting for and you realize, no, they have become the 800-pound gorilla. They've become the monsters that are crushing the little guy, but the perception has not followed the reality.
No, that's so true, Eric. And again, I think it's important to differentiate private sector unions versus public sector unions. I remember Schwarzenegger had this great line, one of his few, but he had a great line when he was governor. He said, the problem with public sector unions is they sit on both sides of the negotiating table. Because of their political power and the ability that they have to put politicians into their positions, they get a chance to negotiate themselves. And obviously the state and our taxpayers are the worst for it.
I mean, it does seem to me that the state of California has to be broke or be beyond broke. I mean, how can this continue? These cities, when you see the homeless camps in downtown San Francisco or Los Angeles, you really wonder how that is possible in America.
No, that's true, Eric. And whenever friends from out of state ask me about the future of conservatism in the state and the Republican Party, I say I'm short-term pessimistic, but medium-term optimistic. And those points that you raised there, the governor just recently came out saying that we've got a $54 billion deficit ahead of us, which is going to result in extreme cuts. And as somebody who does a lot of work with cities across the state, I would not be surprised if we saw a half a dozen to a dozen cities attempting to declare bankruptcy here in the next 6 to 12 months. We've just gotten so far over our skis in this last year that when the pandemic hit, we just were not fiscally ready to sustain it. And that starts at the state, at Sacramento, and then all the way through our 482 cities.
Well, one of the things that I'm, very, very public about is my fury at usually evangelical Christians who don't vote. They have very shallow theology, and they think that means that I shouldn't bother to vote. But we know that if simply the evangelical Christians in California had voted in the last election, there's no way that Gavin Newsom would have been elected. And you think this is a staggering failure of the church and of pastors to speak out. I mean, you have to know that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Eric. We are seen as a pretty deep blue state out here, but as somebody who's engaged in my own church community, I know a lot of people in my own church community who just have kind of wiped their hands of politics, but we're suffering because of that. These challenges that we face here, whether it's our inability to go back to school because of the teachers unions basically preventing that from happening, to these issues around finance more broadly. These are all issues that we as people of faith need to be engaged in, and it does start at the ballot box.